let's keep things moving with our next presenter, Diana Suvorova, software engineer at Uber. Diana is going to present Humble GraphQL, how the GraphQL platform is evolving alongside other data fetching strategies at Uber. And Diana, it looks like you are on mute. So if you can unclick that mute button, the stage is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Brian. Yes, so my name is Diana, and I'm going to talk about how we evolve our GraphQL platform alongside other data fetching strategies at Uber. So there are a few parts to this equation. So first is myself. As I mentioned, my name is Diana. I'm originally from Moscow, Russia. I have been with Uber for the past 5 years, and I'm part of the web platform team there. The second part is Uber. It is known for its rides and food delivery services, although the company has other lines of businesses as well. It has been founded in 2009 and is headquartered in San Francisco, California, where I'm at right now as well. So Uber as a company is a lot of things, but for the purpose of this conversation, the important parts is that it is a microservices-driven organization. To throw some numbers, we have on the order of several thousands of microservices that our engineering team maintains, and that essentially makes Uber platform. And we also joined a monorepo trend, meaning all our code base is hosted in one of the few language-based monorepos. So the team I work for personally, the platform supports, among other things, a JavaScript monorepo at Uber. So last but not least is GraphQL. I think you have heard about GraphQL by now, since you're here. But also this is a definition I have found online, and I largely agree with this. This is a query language for your API. So quite often, or in a lot of times when I look for resources online or conference talks advocating for GraphQL, especially for like a reasonably sized established engineering organizations like Uber's, the story usually includes an episode how backend and front-end developers got together in the same room, maybe with some product managers, decided on the perfect schema and some perfect implementation with clear ownership, and kind of were happily ever after. This has never happened at Uber, or I may not be invited to these meetings. More likely explanation is that for those cross-team meetings for large engineering organizations, there has to be like official decision on a quite high level to commit to GraphQL at a company scale. And that did not happen just yet. Instead, here's what happened. We introduced GraphQL to Uber in 2019, and it is a preferred communication protocol and for JavaScript frontends, preferred and default. Pretty much 90% of our web apps use GraphQL in one way or another. And to throw some more numbers, Uber is not very known for its web presence. When people think about Uber, they mostly would think about mobile apps, although Uber has a quite large number of front-end engineers. We talk about thousands of projects managed by hundreds of different teams. So the GraphQL at Uber has remained an area of web platform responsibility. There were no conversation with, there are conversations with backend folks. There's certainly some interested people who would like to introduce GraphQL on mobile as well, but it's not a mainstream technology for Uber. So Uber backend actually lives and breathes protobuf. Uber has officially doubled down on protobuf as a source of truth for the company data model. And while GraphQL and protobuf are not necessarily at odds with one another, I do think that a sort of long-term, the winning model would be some hybrid between the two. But at the moment, it is quite unlikely that Uber will embrace two or somewhat overlapping standards equally on a company level. So, since we strongly believe in the technology that GraphQL, that kind of the benefits it provides to the community, we introduced it for the web. And here's how we did it. So our schemas are generated as one-to-one mapping to backend service specs. And we store schemas, our sub-schemas statically. There are no runtime GraphQL microservices, and each product team is combining parts of the schema to create a runtime environment for each individual service. Important part for us as a monorepo, we do cross-validation between front-end and kind of GraphQL schemas, and it is enforced by CI platform and monorepo tooling. To make a change in the shared sub-schema, you would need to make sure that it is consistent with all the front-end that are relying on this sub-schema. And it is communally owned, or some would say also unowned, but it is a very interesting, quite clever ownership model that solves some key problems and has its upsides and downsides for sure. So in short, we prioritized an ease of adoption for GraphQL at the expense of schema quality. Again, our schema generated in 90% of the cases is one-to-one mapping to backend spec. And you can make adjustments to the result, but you have to be educated and motivated to do so. And while the two standards, meaning protobuf and GraphQL, overlapping in its ideal best practices, such as domain-oriented schema design, it is also different in how it's practically implemented. And if you take protobuf as a source of truth, the result will be less than ideal from a GraphQL API design perspective. So we were running this approach for 2 years at Uber now, and the results are in. And they're not necessarily surprising. You probably could predict where we got by now. So we sort of got this normal distribution of a developer's opinion on GraphQL tech. So one group, let's call them GraphQL champions, they are just offended by sort of our approach to GraphQL. Those are developers who have used GraphQL before. They know this technology, they love it, and they're rightfully disappointed at our take on it. And the other group, another minority kind of a group, is, and I think that this second group is sort of growing in numbers, so at least from my kind of a humble observation of it. Those who try GraphQL and they decided to switch back to plain RPC for a variety of reasons, which I sort of mostly agree with. Those are like RPC minimalist people. Again, in my sort of observation, those are the kind of those hardcore engineers that still use mechanical keyboard, use Vim as their preferred code editor. And they prefer no extra layer of abstractions between them and like electrons running for the wire. So they don't want anything additional to whatever, just absolutely necessary. And remaining is a majority who use GraphQL. As I said, it's default and communication protocol. They're not very vocal. As with any majority, we don't know what they think. They have better things to do than think about GraphQL. So they use it, and yes, we don't hear much for them. So the question is, where do we go from here? And to answer this question, I first wanted to understand where we are actually at. And more concretely is what is GraphQL gives us without having this ideal connected schema, which I certainly wish we had. So currently what it gives to us is, first of all, a type safety chain. For monorepo, it is hugely important. I'm not going to go into details of why static types are important in JavaScript, or why should you use static types. But for monorepo purposes, where a lot of teams reusing different projects, for our ability to guarantee consistency and consistent changes, a robust type safety change is absolutely crucial. So this is what GraphQL gives us. We can easily, obviously, generate the types from the schema and cross-reference the query that use it. Caching, and here I would also actually mention client-side caching mainly. Mainly our backend caching, which comes with GraphQL and data loader patterns, quite hindered by our not perfect schema, let's say. We still use those patterns, but certainly they're not as effective as they would be if we would have perfectly defined types and ways to get them. Next, it is filtering transformation layer, that any additional logic that you want to be in between the backend and the front end. And obviously tons of tooling, documentation, schema browsing, all those wonderful tools that GraphQL community have kind of developed, and I love to use this. So now going back to our two groups that I mentioned before, and you can guess that the first group would say that GraphQL just does not worth additional complexity, and they do not see benefit in using it. While the other would say that we need to invest more into schema consistency, the connectedness of the schema, and the people will understand the benefits. So like in this type of kind of debates, I do believe this is more or less a personal choice, and we can go around in circle trying to convince one group or another in opposite opinion. The other approach is to have somebody higher up, as I mentioned, commit to long-term direction to use GraphQL, which again is a wonderful option, which I hope we're going to get to eventually. But without that, we sort of did not have to make a choice between the two. Since Uber has such a talented and motivated engineers that are looking forward to contribute to the tooling we use, we decided to pursue both strategies, at least for the next iteration. And here how it is look for us. So here's a very high-level diagram for the web platform data fetching story at Uber. So at the top level, we have our cloud. It is not very well illustrated at this diagram, but you can imagine roughly 4,000 microservices running around in circles there. Each has their own ideal represented in protobuf, which we synchronize to be used by our web monorepo. The next two layers is our both tenants of the web monorepo. And the first one is backend for frontend that would be serving JavaScript and HTML for the client, and also would be a place to spin up your GraphQL service in case you choose to use your GraphQL. And client side is anything that gets shipped to the client, obviously, to the browser. So using backend IDLs, which I mentioned, those protobuf definitions, we generate node clients to make requests runtime via gRPC and request response type for each, so those static type chain story. And then we have two possible track that you get to choose between for your front end and depending on your preference. So the first track is RPC track, which is on the left. We have developed an internal util that propagates those node generated backend types to be used and to be passed down to the front end, which, as I mentioned before, is one of the most important things for us at the platform to make sure we support fetch with type for all data fetching strategies we allow. And on the backend front end, backend for front end, you don't need, in addition, anything really in addition to maybe your like favorite fetch node library, or you can use directly the node provided ones. So the client, we do recommend using client-side caching on top of React. React is kind of a known for or the community around React known for iterating on the recommended default service state management. For now, kind of the most popular and the most reasonable upon our evaluation seems to be React query. And that's what we recommend you use. But again, you can go with plain React as it is. Can manage state there, but not much caching. And in case you have gone with GraphQL option or GraphQL architecture, you will have GraphQL service and the clients in your stack included. And we use Apollo. Using also GraphQL CodeGen, which is an open source project which is by the Guild. And along with some proprietary add-ons for our monorepo, we generate those static types that can be used in the front end for each query request and response types. And that allows us to enforce that static chain, obviously. And GraphQL client in the case is that the one who takes care of the client-side caching. So for the GraphQL platform, at this point, we have a goal to improve schema quality, right? And we have to do it gradually and consistently since we have already quite large consumers of that schema. I do believe that GraphQL is quite friendly to iterative changes to its schema. So we're gradually raising the bar upon our code generation and schema connectedness checks. We are also addressing the problem of the schema ownership. As I mentioned earlier, we are talking about quite a large number of schema that we maintain, given the number of microservices. An approach that we went for to identify a set of core plugins, which is actually a quite small portion of overall number of microservices that are used by the most front end. Those would be user, trip, order, anything that majority of the front end can rely on. And for those, we have a much higher bar for changes in types and schema resolvers. And the rest of the microservices are usually used by single front end and doesn't need really much curation from central teams. So as a conclusion, we don't have a central mandate on GraphQL for better or for worse. We are evolving it in a true open market fashion. We let it prove itself against other competing options. So while I'm still quite bullish on GraphQL for its way more client-centric approach to API design than any other alternative, I also believe that in a lot of cases that I run in our code base, people really just do not need this abstraction. And as a parting note, one last thing that I wanted to mention, of course, one problem that we're still looking to get a proper solution for is that fragmentation we allow on our platform. And we do look into the options to seamlessly integrate the two platforms or data fetching strategies that we encourage in our monorepo. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Diana. And let's get some emoji claps in chat. We do have one small question. I think you kind of answered it through the presentation. Ty asked it pretty early on. Ty asked about what did you mean by communally owned? Is that the idea that these two kind of different communities are going at it, and then the best one will win long term?
Yes, I think in the case, the term I use, communally owned, is like individual subschemas. And as I mentioned, the majority of our cases is a subschema sort of mapped to backend microservice. And communally owned really means that yes, it's like a package, and usually the team that originally created it would be responsible for continuous changes to it. But if they're a different team that potentially needs like either competing changes or some other changes, there's those things has to be bubbled up to a higher level. Honestly, it doesn't happen pretty often. As I mentioned, there's a very small portion of those plugins that being used more than just by a single team, as how microservices usually evolve at very specialized. And those plugins that we do take central kind of ownership on, meaning like a web platform team decide which makes sense and which doesn't.
Awesome. And thank you so much for presenting today. I think it's actually a really great secondary perspective to see a company kind of keeping both fetch methods alive as they go. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Sometimes I wish after watching some of those cool talks, I wish we did some great VP came and say, GraphQL is the thing to be. But reality for Uber as it didn't happen. I hope it will.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much, Diana.
All right. Thank you.